In Underhill, Vermont, a captain is packing his things to go to the airport. Captain Phillips took a photo of his family and put it in his bag. After checking his destination on the computer, he checked the time on his watch and went to the car with his bag. Andrea, his wife, came rushing and got into the car with him, and they started driving together. While they were driving to the airport, Andrea noticed that he was uneasy and asked if he was okay.
You all right?
She then proceeded to tell him how much more tiring this trip was than expected. They then started to talk about how the world is changing so fast. He told Andrea that life had not been easy, that it was necessary to be strong to survive and compete at this time, and that their children were especially going through a difficult time. He told Andrea that although both of their children were doing well, their son Danny's focus on education would pay off later in finding a job. Andrea assured him that everything would be fine, and the two of them continued their journey. After they arrived at the airport, they kissed, and he told her he would call her when he arrived. She said goodbye and took the car back home. In Somalia, a group of young people gathered, some of them holding guns. The sun burned down on the sandy land, making the air heavy with heat. In the distance, the sound of cars broke the stillness. The quiet group turned their heads, eyes fixed on the approaching vehicles. A boy ran toward Abduwali Muse, who was sleeping under a small patch of shade. He shook him awake with urgency, his movements quick and restless. Muse blinks against the bright light, then grabs his gun and steps outside. The cars stopped and armed men got out. One of them, loud and aggressive, fired his gun into the air, making the crowd flinch. His voice carried across the area as he questioned Hufan, demanding to know why there was no water. There was a threat in his tone, one that left no room for excuses. He warned that their king expected payment and ordered them to bring water and money without delay. Amid the tension, Bilal rushed toward Muse. He was eager to go with them, knowing that his sister had already agreed. Around them, young men from the area gathered, wanting the same chance. This was an opportunity. If they went, they could earn money and change their futures. Muse and Assad moved through the crowd, carefully selecting their crew. After a brief moment, the decision was made: Bilal, Elmi, and Najee. The choice of Najee surprised the locals. He was not one of them, yet Muse had made his choice. With the team ready, they set out for the ship, leaving a trail of dust behind them as they moved forward. On the ship, Hufan was the leader, with Assad, Muse, and their crew under his command. Some were already working, while Assad called for others to gather and assist him. However, their faces showed reluctance. They were not pleased with his orders. Meanwhile, Captain Phillips arrived at Salah Port, Oman. Around him, workers were busy, moving back and forth as containers were loaded and unloaded. The sound of machinery filled the air. The captain stepped into the workspace, greeting those around him as he walked. As he boarded the ship, he met Shane and exchanged greetings. Shane asked about his family, whether they were doing well, and how things had been lately. Captain Phillips, in turn, asked about the situation on board and their upcoming plans. Shane informed him that their next destination was Somalia. At that moment, concern flickered across the captain's face. Without hesitation, he instructed Shane to tighten security, knowing they were heading toward the Horn of Africa. With preparations underway, Captain Phillips and his crew began their journey. As they sailed, he moved around the ship, making sure everything was running smoothly. When he entered the office, he found his colleagues gathered together. Turning to Shane, he asked for the timesheet and posted it on the wall. Then, in a firm voice, he reminded them that their shift had ended. At once, the crew got up and headed back to their duties. The Somali crew received instructions from their leader on the best route to take with their ships. That night, Captain Phillips sat in his office aboard the ship, reading about the ongoing threats in Somalia on his computer. By morning, he shared what he had learned with his crew, warning them to stay alert. The crew acknowledged his concerns and started preparing for any upcoming threat that might come, while also working on what they are supposed to do. However, as Captain Phillips looked out at the vast ocean, he noticed something unusual approaching. His instincts kicked in. Grabbing his radio, he called Shane, informing him that an unidentified threat was getting closer. Even as they adjusted their course, two skiffs continued to follow them. Realizing the situation was serious, Captain Phillips ordered every crew member to gather at their designated stations. He then instructed Shane to contact the U.S. Maritime Emergency Line. But despite repeated calls, there was no response.
Answer at the U.S. Maritime Emergency Line.
With growing concern, Captain Phillips told Shane to contact UKMTO instead. This time, they answered, but their response was uncertain. They acknowledged the potential danger, but suggested that the approaching vessels could also be fishermen.
Chances are it's just fishermen.
Meanwhile, the Somalians advanced toward the ship in a small boat. Captain Phillips, watching closely, spotted the weapons they carried. On the boat, the young Somalis spoke among themselves about the amount of money they could make from this operation. Their determination grew as they neared the ship. Realizing they were getting too close, Captain Phillips urgently called for an air response, warning that the intruders would soon start shouting threats. However, their communication line was hacked, allowing the Somalians to overhear everything. This sudden revelation caused Adis and his crew to panic, and they quickly turned their boat around, retreating in fear. But the boat carrying Muse did not turn back. Instead, it continued its pursuit, closing in on the ship with unwavering determination. As the boat neared, Captain Phillips made a quick decision. Then suddenly, the engine of the Somali boat stopped, bringing it to a sudden halt. Muse's crew grew frustrated, their plan disrupted, while Captain Phillips' crew felt a wave of relief wash over them. That night, the crew gathered for coffee, exhaustion still lingering in the air. Captain Phillips joined them, acknowledging the danger they had faced earlier. He praised their teamwork and reassured them that, for now, they would return to their usual duties. Just as he was about to leave, a crew member hesitated before asking what would happen if the same thing occurred again.
They're coming back.
Without hesitation, Captain Phillips admitted that it would happen again. But just as their strategy had worked today, it would work in the future. The crew exchanged uneasy glances before breaking into complaints. They were young, they argued, and they had never signed up for this kind of life-threatening experience. On top of that, they weren't being paid well enough for such risks. Shane, however, reminded them that they should have considered these dangers before signing their contracts. Traveling through the Horn of Africa always came with risks. Frustrated by their complaints, Captain Phillips raised his voice, telling them that if anyone wanted to quit, they could come to his office, sign the papers, and leave their job immediately. His tone made it clear this was not up for debate. Later that night, Captain Phillips wrote to his wife, assuring her that he was fine. He told her that his team was doing well and promised to call once they reached their final port. Meanwhile, in Somalia, the crew that had failed earlier began preparing for another attempt. They discussed ways to be more organized for their next attack. As they worked on building a new boat, tension grew between Muse and Assad. Muse turned to Assad and questioned why he hadn't given him the engine. Assad's expression darkened. Anger flared in his eyes as he snapped at Muse, his voice sharp with accusation. Without warning, he pulled out his gun and pressed it to Muse's head. For a moment, the air stood still. Then, in a sudden movement, Muse struck first, driving a sharp object into Assad's head. In the morning, Shane called Captain Phillips while he was in his room, asking him to come immediately. When the captain arrived, he saw that the same boat from the previous day had returned. This time, it was only Muse's crew. Shane quickly tried to contact the U.S. Maritime Emergency Line, and Captain Phillips reported their situation. But despite their efforts, the boat kept moving closer. From the boat, Muse demanded that Alabama's crew stop their ship. Then, gunfire erupted. Muse's men started shooting toward the ship. Fear spread among the crew as they gathered in one place, unsure of what to do. In desperation, they poured water down from the ship, hoping to slow the attackers. But Muse's crew kept adjusting their position, refusing to back down. Captain Phillips and Shane fired back, but their shots fell short, unable to reach the attackers. Determined to board, Muse's crew threw a ladder toward the ship. The Alabama crew tried to shift their course, but it was too late. The ladder caught hold of the ship. One by one, Muse's men climbed aboard. Captain Phillips's heart sank. His face showed pure disappointment as he realized the ship had been breached. Seeing that the intruders were getting closer, the captain quickly sent a message to the Alabama crew, instructing them to lock all doors immediately. He ordered everyone to hide and remain silent. No one was to come out unless they heard a secret word from him. He reminded them that they knew the ship better than the attackers and could use that to their advantage. He assured them that if they stayed hidden, they would be okay. Muse and his crew forced their way in, firing their guns to break the door open. They stormed into the room where Captain Phillips, Kenny, and one of Alabama's crew members were. Shock filled the room as the intruders faced them. Muse made his intentions clear. He wasn't after human lives, only money. He warned them that as long as they didn't try anything, they would only take what they needed and leave. He then turned to Captain Phillips and demanded to know where the ship came from and what it was carrying. The captain answered calmly, saying the ship was from America and was transporting food. He also mentioned that they had $30,000 on board. However, he added that the ship was in trouble and couldn't move. Just then, a noise echoed through the ship as workers moved around in the distance. Muse hesitated, narrowing his eyes. Without wasting time, he ordered his men to keep their guns on the captain and his team while he moved toward the ship's engine, touching various controls. Moments later, he returned and, with a threatening tone, demanded to know where the rest of the crew was. Captain Phillips remained firm, insisting that he was the only one there and had no idea where the others had gone. Muse wasn't convinced. He ordered the captain to bring out the crew. Captain Phillips picked up the radio and spoke into it, but he carefully avoided using the secret words. Sensing the deception, Muse snatched the radio from his hands and gave a harsh warning. If the crew didn't come out, he would start killing them one by one. Fear spread through the ship. Najee raised his gun and pressed it against Kenny's head, beginning to count down. The tension in the room grew unbearable. Desperate to protect his crew, Captain Phillips stepped forward. He told Muse to take him instead, to kill him if they had to, but to spare the others. He was the captain, and the conversation should end with him. Muse stared at him for a moment before signaling his men to stop. He then demanded to search the ship himself. In that instant, Captain Phillips made a discreet move. He turned the radio on and, pretending to adjust it, spoke loudly, letting his hidden crew know that Muse and his men were about to search for them. Though fear gripped them, the crew understood the message. They knew they had to think fast and come up with a plan. 2 crew members quietly slipped out of the engine room. One of them made his way to turn on the lights, while Shane remained hidden in the dining room. Meanwhile, Muse and Bilal, along with Captain Phillips, started searching different rooms. Muse handed the captain the radio, forcing him to carry it as they moved. The other 2 Somali crew members stayed behind in the room. As they searched, Muse noticed an emergency sign on the wall showing directions to the engine room. His eyes narrowed. He immediately ordered the captain to take them there. Captain Phillips hesitated. He knew his crew was hiding in the engine room. Trying to divert them, he warned that it would be too hot inside and there was no reason to go. But Muse didn't care. He insisted. Just before they could leave, the captain stalled again, asking for water, knowing they would need it in the heat. Seizing the chance, he led them to the dining area. At that moment, Shane was already inside. Hearing voices, he quickly ducked into a hiding spot. As they stepped in, Captain Phillips spotted Shane, but acted quickly, moving in a way to block their view. Bilal, curious, started to follow him further inside. The captain remained calm and casually said there was no one in the room. He explained that the space was only used for storing food, nothing more. Noticing that Bilal was barefoot, the captain warned him about broken bottles on the floor, suggesting that he step back to avoid injury. Still watching closely, Muse studied the captain's face with suspicion. After a moment, he ordered them to continue to the engine room. Once they had left, Shane wasted no time. He pulled out his radio and urgently contacted the hidden crew, warning them that Muse and his men were on their way. He told them to break a glass bottle and scatter the shards near the entrance, since one of the intruders was barefoot. Without hesitation, the crew followed Shane's instructions, preparing for what was to come. Captain Phillips, Muse, and Bilal made their way to the engine room. Bilal was the first to open the door and step inside. The moment his foot touched the ground, a sharp pain shot through him. A piece of broken glass had pierced his bare foot. He let out a scream, stumbling backward in agony. Seeing this, Captain Phillips acted innocent, pretending to be shocked. He urged Muse to leave, insisting that his friend was injured and needed help. But Muse wasn't convinced. His eyes narrowed as he looked around. He muttered that something wasn't right. He refused to leave without searching the place thoroughly. Despite Bilal's continued cries of pain, Muse started descending into the engine room. Above them, Najee was keeping watch. However, one of Alabama's crew members carefully made his way to the switch outside the engine room. Without making a sound, he reached up and flipped it. The engine room went completely dark. Muse froze. He turned to the captain, demanding to know what was happening. Captain Phillips remained calm, replying that the ship was in terrible condition and things like this happened all the time. Muse wasn't entirely convinced, but for the moment, he had another priority. He instructed Bilal and Somali to go to the first room and send 2 of their men back to him. Then, he ordered the captain to follow Bilal out of the engine room. Meanwhile, Muse continued searching the engine room. The Alabama crew, hidden inside, held their breath, their hearts pounding as they watched his every move. As Muse stepped deeper into the room, he suddenly heard a faint sound behind him. He spun around, but before he could react, strong hands grabbed him from the shadows. A struggle broke out. Muse thrashed, but the crew overpowered him, choking him until he gasped for air. Bilal and Captain Phillips went to the others. Bilal was still grunting in pain. Najee, standing guard, immediately asked what had happened. Bilal told him that they set up a trap of broken glasses. Najee's expression darkened with rage. His grip on his weapon tightened. At that moment, Alabama's crew called the captain's room. Their voices echoed through the radio, and Najee, still furious, overheard them. His expression twisted with suspicion. He picked up the radio and demanded to know what was happening. On the other end, Muse's voice came through, his tone tense. They had captured their captain. Najee immediately handed the radio to Captain Phillips. Speaking cautiously, Captain Phillips urged Muse to take the $30,000 they had and leave peacefully. No one had to get hurt. For a moment, Muse considered the deal. But before he could respond, Najee suddenly snatched the radio. His voice rang out, filled with fury. $1 million, not thousands, he shouted. Najee and Bilal led Captain Phillips, who carefully counted the money before handing it over to them. Once the transaction was complete, they stepped outside and ran into Shane, who instructed them to head to Alabama's lifeboat. At that moment, Muse's crew demanded to see their leader.
Where is our captain?
Captain Phillips assured Najee that Muse would be sent to them once they were safely aboard the lifeboat. However, Najee and the others refused. They insisted that Captain Phillips come with them, promising to release him only after Muse joined them. Despite the tension, Captain Phillips stepped into the lifeboat. Behind him, Shane yelled in protest, warning him not to go. Inside the lifeboat, Captain Phillips asked who would be steering. Seeing their uncertainty, he showed Elmi how to control the vessel. Meanwhile, the Alabama crew watched closely as Muse was finally allowed to board. But in an instant, everything changed. As soon as Muse was inside, the Somalis seized their moment. They kidnapped Captain Phillips and sped away in the lifeboat. From the Alabama crew, shouts of anger and frustration erupted. Not long after, help arrived. The USS Bainbridge, led by Captain Commander Frank Castellano, approached the scene. The task force had been deployed to assist the Alabama crew. On board, Castellano and his team began discussing strategies to handle the situation and rescue Captain Phillips. Meanwhile, on the lifeboat, Muse tried to reassure the captain. He calmly explained that everything would be fine. They would reach Somalia, where Captain Phillips would enjoy their food. Then, they would call his ship's insurance, negotiate a deal, take the money, and send him home safely. Back in Alabama, the ship began tracking the lifeboat, carrying Muse and his crew. Muse noticed and turned to Captain Phillips, his expression darkening. He reminded him that earlier he had claimed the ship was broken. Clearly annoyed, he muttered that if Alabama reached Somalia, it would work out better for them. They could demand much more money. Meanwhile, on the Alabama, Shane and Mike made a decision. They would follow the lifeboat until the task force could intervene and take action. Back in the boat, Captain Phillips told Muse that their mission was to bring food to Africa for the poor. Muse scoffed. He said that large ships always claimed they were bringing food, but instead, they took their fish. It was then that Captain Phillips had a realization. These men were fishermen. Suddenly, Muse's hand was injured, and Captain Phillips offered to give him first aid, but Muse refused. Meanwhile, Bilal continued groaning about his wounded leg. Seeing his pain, the captain asked to help him. This time, Muse allowed it, but the moment Captain Phillips took out scissors, they took the kit from his hands. Meanwhile, aboard the USS Bainbridge, Task Force Commander Frank Castellano and Navy SEAL Commander Howard discussed their next move. Howard insisted that they had to stop the lifeboat before it reached Somali waters. In the lifeboat, feeling dehydrated, Captain Phillips asked for water.
Can I have some water, please?
After a brief pause, Bilal handed him some. At the same time, tension grew. Elmi and Najee argued, their voices rising in frustration. They shouted at each other in Somali, and Captain Phillips, unable to understand their words, could only watch. Muse repeatedly tried to contact Hufan, their boss, but there was no response. Frustration flickered across his face. Later that night, the radio crackled. Hufan had finally responded, but his message wasn't what Muse expected. Hufan, sounding distressed, said he was in trouble and had already gone home. He told Muse and his crew they were on their own now. The atmosphere inside the lifeboat grew heavier. The cramped space made breathing difficult, so they started breaking the window. Muse, attempting to keep control, turned to Captain Phillips and told him that last year he had hijacked a ship and made $6 million. Captain Phillips looked at him and asked, "Then why are you still doing this?" Captain Phillips kept asking questions, and Najee reacted violently. He lunged at the captain, gripping him by the throat and strangling him. His eyes burned with fury as he warned him never to speak like that again. Muse, caught off guard, stepped in to free the captain, pulling Najee away. But Najee didn't back down. Within seconds, a heated fight broke out between the two Somali men, their shouting filling the cramped boat. Then, a piercing siren cut through the chaos. The crew exchanged glances, their breathing heavy. Slowly, Muse reached for the door and cracked it open. What they saw outside made Captain Phillips's heart race with a mix of fear and relief. The Americans had arrived. From the USS Bainbridge, a voice called out to the Alabama lifeboat. A Somali man aboard the U.S. Navy ship spoke directly to Muse's crew, attempting to negotiate peacefully. Muse, trying to maintain control, stated that they only wanted money. He insisted they were just fishermen, not killers. He told them that no one had to get hurt, but they expected $10 million in exchange for Captain Phillips. They had come for money, nothing more. The U.S. Navy negotiator responded, telling them they had brought food for them. After some time, the two U.S. Navy boats approached the lifeboat, carrying supplies and various pieces of equipment, including cameras. As the boats reached the lifeboat, there was a knock. Muse stepped out of the lifeboat and demanded the money, but the U.S. Navy negotiators refused, saying they wouldn't hand over anything until they saw Captain Phillips first. Captain Phillips was brought outside. He spoke to them, assuring them he was unharmed. Then, in a low voice, he asked if his family knew where he was. Seizing the opportunity, he discreetly informed the Navy crew of his seat number inside the lifeboat. The task force carried cameras and began taking pictures of everyone on board. Muse quickly grew suspicious and ordered them to turn the cameras off. Back inside, Najee started shouting and counting aggressively, his voice ringing through the confined space. Captain Phillips tensed, unsure of what was happening. Outside, the task force boats began retreating to their positions. Muse re-entered the lifeboat and slammed the door shut. The commander's voice soon came over the radio, asking if something had gone wrong. Muse hesitated, then answered that it was an emergency, but assured them that everyone was safe. At that moment, Captain Phillips spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. He said he had been shot at and had heard a bullet whistle past his ear. The commander remained calm and urged Muse to resolve the situation peacefully to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. He asked Muse to negotiate, but Muse stayed silent. Finally, he responded, saying he would only talk once they reached Somalia. Then, the lifeboat's engine roared to life, and they started moving again. On the Bainbridge, the task force watched closely. They realized that if they didn't act soon, the lifeboat would reach Somali waters in just 2 hours. A sense of urgency spread through the team. Inside the ship, Captain Phillips tried to convince Muse to stop this, because the Americans won't let him win. But Muse looked at him and told him that he has gone too far, and he can't escape now. That night, as the Navy prepared an aerial operation to intervene, something unexpected happened. Bilal, needing to relieve himself, stepped outside the lifeboat. Moments later, Captain Phillips, seeing a chance, asked to do the same. As he moved outside, he acted fast, shoving Bilal with force. Both men tumbled into the water. The task force spotted the figures in the water, but couldn't immediately identify them. Chaos erupted on the lifeboat. Bilal struggled to swim back, managing to climb aboard. Meanwhile, Muse and Najee frantically searched for Captain Phillips, their eyes scanning the dark waves. Captain Phillips swam desperately, trying to escape. Najee's furious voice rang out over the water and started to shoot, but Muse cut him off, reminding him that they needed the captain alive. For a brief moment, it seemed like Captain Phillips might get away, but then Muse reached him, grabbing hold and dragging him back onto the lifeboat. As soon as they were inside, Najee lashed out, striking Captain Phillips in anger, but Muse stepped in, stopping him. Outside, the sound of rotor blades filled the air. A Navy helicopter hovered above, its spotlight cutting through the night, tracking every move. Muse's crew watched helplessly. Tension crackled in the air as Muse, gripping his weapon tightly, turned to Captain Phillips with a grave warning. If things didn't go his way, he would kill him. Muse pressed a gun to Captain Phillips' head and called the commander, threatening to kill him. Captain Phillips, realizing his time was running out, locked eyes with Muse and quietly said he didn't believe he was a fisherman. Before Muse could respond, a voice from the U.S. Navy came through the radio. They announced that they had come to negotiate and were ready to offer money, but they needed someone to negotiate with. The man on the Navy crew called out their names, proving they knew exactly who they were. Muse, caught off guard, hesitated. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, and after a brief pause, he agreed to talk. But Najee wasn't convinced. He insisted it was a trick, a lie meant to trap them. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy team prepared for action. Armed and ready, they moved toward Alabama's lifeboat. Inside the lifeboat, Muse tried to reassure his crew. He told them everything would be fine and that he would collect the money and go home. But Captain Phillips, watching him carefully, asked why the money he already had wasn't enough. Why not just take what they had and return to Somalia? Muse shook his head. The money, he admitted, wouldn't be enough to satisfy his superiors when he returned. The Navy requested to see Captain Phillips as proof that he was still alive. Muse briefly brought him outside, allowing the Americans to see him. They handed him a t-shirt and instructed him to sit back where he had been. While Muse was distracted, the Navy discreetly tied a rope from the lifeboat to their ship, securing a connection. Hidden speakers were placed nearby, allowing them to eavesdrop on everything inside. Once on the Navy ship, Muse asked for the elders, expecting them to come and negotiate. The officers told him to wait. Meanwhile, their surveillance team closely monitored the lifeboat through cameras. Inside the lifeboat, tension rose. The boat shook slightly, lights flickered, and Elmi struggled to maintain control. Captain Phillips, now wearing the t-shirt, shifted slowly in his seat. Najee, eyes sharp with suspicion, warned him not to move again. But Phillips picked up a pen and quietly scribbled on a tissue. Najee caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. His anger flared. He lunged forward, snatching the tissue from the captain's hand. The two argued, their voices rising, and got into physical altercation. Then, suddenly, Bilal struck Phillips from behind. The blow sent him forward, and before he could react, they tied his hands with rope. Moments later, the situation took a deadly turn. Captain Phillips was blindfolded and suspended by rope. Najee, his patience gone, decided it was time to kill him. Bilal and Elmi panicked, pleading with him to stop, but Najee was furious. He argued that there would be no money, no rescue. The only option left was to kill the captain. Bilal, still shaken, refused. He insisted that if they killed the captain, they would all die too. Tears welled in Captain Phillips's eyes. His voice trembled as he called out his wife's name and his son, Danny's, telling them he loved them. Bilal saw the raw fear on his face. Then, everything changed. As Najee prepared to pull the trigger, the U.S. Navy acted. On the commander's order, the rope holding the lifeboat went taut. Snipers, locked on their targets, fired. Within seconds, the three pirates were dead. A chilling silence followed. Phillips, still blindfolded, flinched at the sound of gunfire. He gasped, his body trembling as he cried out, unaware of what had just happened. The Navy team, watching from their ship, breathed in relief. Their mission was a success. Cheers erupted as they celebrated, knowing the captain was safe. The Navy informed Muse that it was over. His friends are dead and the captain is safe. Muse is going to prison. Aboard the Bainbridge, Captain Phillips was rescued. But the ordeal had left him in severe shock. His hands shook and his breathing was uneven. The Navy doctors moved quickly, helping him as he struggled to process everything. He was finally safe, but the weight of what had happened would stay with him forever.